You don't think about it. Nobody does. It's automatic, a squeeze of gel, 30 seconds under warm water, maybe a second pass because you touched the subway pole on the way home last night, and something about that interaction still lives in the back of your mind as a category of contamination requiring correction. You wash your hands before breakfast. You shower before you leave. You carry a small bottle of sanitizer in your jacket pocket because the world outside your front door is apparently something that needs to be cleaned off your skin before you can comfortably re-enter your own home. Now take all of that away. Not for a camping weekend where you return Sunday evening grateful for running water and a bar of soap. Permanently for the entire span of your life and every life before it, for hundreds of thousands of years, stretching back to the earliest populations of anatomically modern humans walking across the African savanna, surviving ice ages, crossing land bridges, populating every continent on Earth through sheer physical endurance. No soap, no bottled shampoo with its 16-syllable ingredient list, no conditioner, no exfoliating scrub formulated by a team of dermatologists in a building with keycard access, no toothbrush, no mouthwash with its blue-green liquid that tastes like a medical procedure, no fluoride, no tongue scraper, no interdental brush, no deodorant, no chemical antiperspirant that blocks the glands your body evolved over millions of years specifically to keep functional. No running water at all, actually, just a river half a mile's walk from the camp, a fire that smokes more than it heats, and a community of people who have been living physically demanding, fully embodied lives on this earth for as long as anyone alive can remember. Your ancestors did this every single day, for most of human existence, not a century, not a millennium, but hundreds of thousands of years. Homo sapiens woke up, moved through the world, and kept themselves functional, healthy, and apparently clean enough not only to survive repeated encounters with everything that could kill them, but to build the knowledge systems, social structures, and biological resilience that eventually produced modern civilization. They did all of this without a single product found in any modern bathroom cabinet. So how did ancient humans stay clean without soap? Not survive-level clean, not barely getting by clean, clean enough to avoid the infections that kill, clean enough to keep wounds from turning septic before any immunity had a chance to work, clean enough that their teeth lasted decades in mouths doing work that modern teeth never have to do, clean enough that their skin stayed intact despite daily exposure to soil and microorganisms and physical trauma, clean enough that their hair didn't mat into an impenetrable mass that housed parasites. This wasn't incidental. This was biology, botany, and thousands of generations of accumulated collective knowledge operating in precise coordination, and almost none of it required the products a modern person spends $60 or $100 a month on without a second thought. The answer is older, stranger, and more sophisticated than almost anyone expects. The modern assumption about ancient hygiene runs something like this. Ancient people were dirty, perpetually grimy, somewhat malodorous, a bit verminous around the scalp. That's why life before the modern era was what it was, short, hard, disease-ridden, and one of the primary reasons was the absence of proper hygiene. Progress meant cleanliness. Soap was civilization. The bathroom cabinet was progress made visible and organized by price point. It's an enormously flattering story for the present. It is also, in meaningful and important ways, wrong. Anthropologists, studying the skeletal remains of pre-agricultural hunter-gatherers, consistently find something that surprises researchers who come to the material expecting the grimy, infection-riddled past they've been promised. Comparatively excellent dental health, fewer cavities than their farming descendants, less bone infection, healthier gum lines, better preservation of tooth enamel into middle and old age. Middle age, remember, being a relative concept when life expectancy calculations are heavily weighted by infant mortality rather than the actual lifespan of individuals who survived early childhood. It was only after the agricultural revolution, after humans settled into permanent villages, packed together in unprecedented population densities, began eating carbohydrate-heavy grain diets that fed the bacteria responsible for tooth decay, and stopped covering 20 kilometers a day on foot, that the explosion of dental disease and infectious illness really accelerated. The archaeological skeleton record is blunt about this. A foundational comparative study examining dental remains from populations spanning the transition from foraging to agriculture across multiple geographic regions, produced by Dr. Clark Spencer Larson at Ohio State University and appearing in the Annual Review of Anthropology in 1995, found a consistent cross-cultural pattern. Hunter-gatherers showed significantly lower rates of carious lesions, lower rates of enamel defects associated with infectious stress and nutritional deprivation, and less periosteal bone inflammation compared to early agricultural populations living in the same geographic areas in the generations immediately after the transition. The farming revolution improved food security in terms of predictability and caloric availability. It enabled population growth. It did not improve health in the short term. In several measurable biological respects, it made things substantially worse before eventual advances in sanitation and nutrition improved them again. Cleanliness was not something ancient humans had to invent from scratch in the absence of products. It was something they maintained through methods so deeply embedded in daily physical life that they left almost no direct archaeological trace in many cases. And the first of those methods started, of all places, in the mouth. Here's where it gets strange. In 2019, researchers at the University of Adelaide's Australian Centre for Ancient DNA published the results of a detailed analysis of dental calculus, the hardened mineralized plaque that calcifies progressively on tooth surfaces during life, extracted from human skulls spanning nearly 7,500 years of European prehistory, ranging from Mesolithic hunter-gatherer populations through Bronze Age farming communities. Lead researcher Dr. Laura Weyrich and her team were examining the genetic content of ancient oral microbiomes, looking at which bacteria had lived in these ancient mouths, how they'd changed over the agricultural transition, what the patterns revealed about ancient diet and health. What they found embedded inside those fossilized mouth deposits went beyond what they expected. Not simply food residue, not merely dead bacteria and their genetic remnants, not just the predictable trace of diet reconstructed from digested plant and animal material, plant matter, specific, identifiable, non-dietary plant matter, poplar bark, wild onion, in several samples traces of compounds consistent with yarrow, a low-growing perennial herb with small pale clustered flowers, slightly bitter-smelling when the leaves are bruised, that still grows across temperate meadows throughout Europe, and has been documented in medical pharmacopoeias for its anti-inflammatory and antimicrobial properties since written records began in the ancient Mediterranean world. These were not accidental dietary residues. Poplar bark contains salicylates, the same chemical family that aspirin belongs to, and which aspirin's inventors deliberately isolated and synthesized from. Salicylates reduce inflammation in gum tissue and suppress the proliferation of certain bacteria when held in direct contact with inflamed oral surfaces for extended periods. Yarrow contains achilleic acid and several sesquiterpene lactones with demonstrated antibacterial and anti-inflammatory activity. The concentrations and distribution of these plant compounds in the ancient dental calculus samples were consistent with deliberate, repeated use. Not swallowing, not the incidental residue of cooking, but specifically chewing and holding these materials against tooth and gum surfaces as a maintenance practice. The mouths of ancient Europeans weren't incidentally healthy. They were actively tended with a botanical precision that implied accumulated, transmitted, multi-generational knowledge of what specific plants did to specific problems in a specific part of the body. In a parallel study in 2017, Dr. Hannes Schroeder at the Natural History Museum of Denmark examined dental calculus from Neolithic individuals found at multiple burial sites across northern Europe, with remains dating as far back as 5,500 BCE, more than 7,000 years ago, well before writing, well before the earliest Bronze Age states, well within the period of small-scale farming communities whose material culture was otherwise modest. What the team extracted from calcified plaque included evidence of at least 16 different plant species. Several had no obvious nutritional value. They weren't food plants with any documented role in the diets of northern European communities. They weren't flavor plants in any known traditional culinary tradition. And their presence in the mouth in repeated small quantities across multiple individuals at multiple sites pointed toward a single, more plausible interpretation: deliberate medicinal use with a specific oral application. One plant identified in samples from a burial site in Denmark, a site predating any written medical record in northern Europe by several millennia, was later tested in laboratory conditions against Streptococcus mutans, the primary bacterium responsible for tooth decay and among the most studied oral pathogens in modern dentistry. It inhibited the pathogen at concentrations consistent with the amounts present in the calculus. Ancient humans were not brushing their teeth with anything resembling a modern toothbrush, but they were doing something to their mouths that produced measurably better dental outcomes than what most people in the early agricultural period achieved, something that implied a detailed, specific working understanding of which plants addressed which oral problems. In cultures documented by ethnobotanists that maintained no contact with industrialized dentistry, populations studied across sub-Saharan Africa, across the Arabian Peninsula, across the Indian subcontinent, the use of what researchers standardly call chewing sticks has been documented continuously and in remarkable consistency into the modern era. The most extensively studied single example is the miswak, a thin twig cut from the Salvadora persica tree, called the toothbrush tree in English. Precisely because of this use, its cut end frayed progressively by chewing into a soft, splayed, brush-like tip that abraded tooth surfaces, while the plant material beneath the fraying surface was chewed and its compounds mixed with saliva. The practice of daily miswak use is traceable through written Islamic tradition to at least the 7th century CE. But the deep integration of the Salvadora persica tree into the cultivated landscapes surrounding settlements across its growing range, a range spanning East Africa, the Horn of Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, Pakistan, northwestern India, suggests deliberate cultivation and organized use stretching back considerably further than any written record confirms. In 2003, the World Health Organization formally acknowledged miswak's clinical effectiveness in a review of traditional oral hygiene practices that assessed available research and compared it to modern dental care standards. The wood of Salvadora persica contains benzyl isothiocyanate, a sulfur-containing compound with potent antibacterial activity. It also contains natural fluoride salts in concentrations measurable by standard analytical chemistry, silica particles that act as a mild mechanical abrasive, and tannins with documented gum tissue strengthening properties. A 2013 meta-analysis consolidating multiple independent clinical studies of Salvadora persica extract against standard oral bacterial pathogens found that the extract killed several species associated with periodontal disease more effectively than chlorhexidine, which is the active antibacterial agent in prescription-grade antimicrobial mouthwash and one of the most potent broad-spectrum bacteriostatics available in modern clinical dentistry. The modern toothbrush did not represent an invention. It represented a rediscovery, its bristled form arriving at a mechanism that a tree had been providing, in cultures without any access to analytical chemistry or clinical trials, for thousands of years. But oral and dental care was only one layer of the problem ancient humans managed without a single modern product. There was a more immediate, more visible, more socially consequential hygiene challenge that required equally precise solutions: air. And what lived in it, head lice Pediculus humanus capitis, are one of the oldest documented human parasites. Their eggs, called nits, adhere to individual hair shafts close to the scalp using a cement-like compound the louse secretes that is extraordinarily resistant to removal by water alone. The nits are practically invisible without close examination, hatch within 7 to 10 days, and begin reproducing within another week. An untreated infestation, in any setting without commercial pediculicide, reaches self-sustaining population density rapidly. In a group living context, a hunter-gatherer band, an agricultural village, a Roman urban tenement, untreated lice spread through direct hair-to-hair contact within weeks. The archaeological evidence for the longevity of this problem is specific and a little startling. In 2000, archaeologist Eli Panagiotakopoulou at the University of Edinburgh analyzed material recovered from sites in ancient Egypt, specifically organic debris from hair combs and textile fragments associated with human habitation at multiple sites spanning several periods of Egyptian history. The analysis found preserved louse eggs and louse fragments in samples dating back to at least 3000 BCE. Lice were present in ancient Egypt. The same evidence appears at Roman-era sites across the empire, at Viking-age Norse sites in Scandinavia, at medieval European contexts. The lice were always there. The question is always what people did about them. The fine-toothed comb is one of the oldest continuously documented tools in the human material record, appearing in archaeological contexts as early as 3500 BCE in Persia and Egypt. Made from wood, bone, ivory, and later from metal, with tines set close enough together to mechanically strip night-cemented eggs from hair shafts when drawn through repeatedly. The technique works. It is still, in the 21st century, considered by many lice treatment specialists to be as effective as chemical pediculicide when performed thoroughly and consistently over the required period. The mechanical removal of every nit from every affected hair shaft, time-consuming, requiring good light and a patient partner, is a genuine treatment, not a folk practice. But mechanical removal was almost never the only approach. Ethnobotanical surveys of plant use across traditional cultures consistently document the application of specific plant-derived oils to the scalp and hair as part of infestation management. Neem oil, derived from the seeds of Azadirachta indica, a tree native to the Indian subcontinent and extensively cultivated across South and Southeast Asia, contains azadirachtin, a compound that disrupts insect hormonal systems, preventing lice from molting successfully between life stages. Application of neem oil to affected hair, combined with fine comb removal, appears in Ayurvedic medical tradition as a described treatment for head lice, and has been confirmed effective in multiple modern clinical trials. Coconut oil's lauric acid content creates a physical suffocation effect on lice at the concentrations achieved by thorough scalp application. Tea tree oil contains terpenen-4-ol, a documented insecticidal compound. What all of these treatments share, beyond their mechanism, is that they were not individual interventions. They required another person. Applying oil to the back of your own scalp and then combing every hair shaft thoroughly is essentially impossible without assistance. The grooming function and the lice treatment function were the same activity performed by the same relationship. Social grooming and parasite management were not parallel practices. They were a single practice with two inseparable outcomes. And this is worth holding for a moment because it changes the frame. Modern hygiene is structurally private. It happens alone, before anyone else arrives, in a room with a lock on the door. The bathroom is one of the most consistently private spaces in modern domestic architecture. Private by design, private by convention, private by the deeply embedded social assumption that bodies are managed in solitude and presented publicly only after the management is complete. Ancient hygiene operated from essentially the opposite assumption. Bodies were tended together because they had to be. The back of the head required another set of eyes, the wound required another pair of hands. The herbal preparation required knowledge that one person rarely held in its entirety. The relationship was the tool, and the tool was both more effective and more durable than any individual could have been alone. The same botanical intelligence that identified which plants to hold against the gums also identified which plants worked against the skin itself. And here, the standard narrative about ancient cleanliness breaks down at a fundamental level. Everyone assumes that ancient skin cleaning was about removing visible contamination, rubbing dirt and debris from the surface and rinsing it away. The truth is that the most effective ancient cleaning systems worked chemically. They functioned because their practitioners understood, without molecular biology or peer-reviewed literature, or any formal concept of a surfactant molecule, that certain plants reacted with the oils already present on human skin in ways that lifted contaminants. They had no name for what was happening, but they knew reliably and precisely what happened when you rubbed certain wet roots against wet skin, and they organized their daily lives around that knowledge. The molecule doing the work is called a saponin. Saponins are a structurally diverse class of natural compounds found in several hundred plant species, united by a shared functional property that makes them uniquely useful for cleaning. They are surfactants, a word that names a molecule with a specific structural duality that makes it chemically remarkable. One portion of the molecule is hydrophilic, meaning it binds to water, while the opposite portion is hydrophobic, meaning it binds to oils and fats. When a saponin molecule is present at the interface between water and oil, it binds simultaneously to both, and in doing so, allows water to encapsulate and lift oil off a surface, suspending it in a lather that can be rinsed away. When you rub a saponin-rich plant material with water against any surface, including skin, the saponins organize themselves at the interface between the water and whatever oil is present on the skin, bind to both simultaneously, and create a foam that carries the oil and everything suspended in it away when rinsed. This is not approximately similar to the mechanism of modern soap. It is the same mechanism. Commercial bar soap, liquid body wash, and shampoo all achieve their cleaning action through surfactant molecules, specifically sodium lauryl sulfate and related synthetic compounds designed to perform the same function that saponins perform naturally. The chemistry is identical at the level of mechanism. The plants were doing it first, using molecules they'd evolved for entirely unrelated reasons, primarily to deter insect feeding and fungal infection, that ancient humans discovered were equally useful for cleaning human bodies. In the Sonoran Desert of what is now Arizona and northwestern Mexico, archaeologists working at sites associated with the Hohokam people, a culture flourishing from approximately 1 CE through 1450 CE, that built extensive irrigation canal systems and maintained a sophisticated regional trade network, found substantial and consistent evidence that the blue agave plant was integrated into daily domestic life not only as a food source and fiber plant, but as a cleaning agent used on both bodies and textiles. The root of Agave americana is extraordinarily rich in saponins, with concentrations running as high as 18% of dry root weight in some analyses. For direct comparison, soapwort Saponaria officinalis, a plant used in European cleaning traditions for centuries and still cultivated in some specialty contexts, contains approximately 2 to 5% saponins by weight. The agave root is 4 to 9 times more concentrated as a cleaning agent by the same mass of material. Ethnobotanist Dr. Gary Naban, conducting research across descendant indigenous communities in the Sonoran region in the 1990s and publishing findings in academic contexts, including economic botany, documented the ongoing transmission of agave root washing practices in communities whose oral tradition traces the technique back through many generations of ancestors. The method is specific, consistent across communities that had not been in significant recent contact with each other, and technically precise. The root is beaten against a wet flat stone or between two stones until it foams generously. Then the foam is worked with both hands into wet hair and skin. It rinses completely clean. It leaves no residue. It removes oils and organic debris with measurable efficiency without the skin dryness or surface stripping that harsh synthetic surfactants can cause. Because the saponin molecule, while a highly effective surfactant, is considerably gentler on the protein and lipid architecture of skin cells than sodium lauryl sulfate. This is not tradition or mythology or a romanticized account of the past. This is applied surfactant chemistry that worked so reliably, that produced such consistent results across generations of use, that it was maintained as active knowledge for centuries in communities that had access to it. Across the Pacific, in island groups throughout Polynesia, the soapberry tree, Sapindus saponaria, was harvested specifically for this purpose. Its fruit husks, dried and stored, provided a concentrated saponin source for washing both bodies and hair. The practice appears in written accounts by the first European navigators to contact Pacific Island cultures in the 18th century, accounts that describe, with varying degrees of comprehension and occasional bemusement, populations practicing sophisticated daily hygiene using locally derived plant materials that produced functional cleansing lather. The deep integration of soapberry trees into the cultivated and semi-cultivated landscapes surrounding Polynesian settlements suggests that deliberate human selection for productive specimens and organized cultivation had been ongoing for considerable time before any European arrived to document it. The saponin content in dried soapberry fruit husks runs approximately 15% by weight, among the highest concentrations found in any documented surfactant plant. Modern shampoo achieves its cleaning action from synthetic sodium lauryl sulfate and related compounds. The soapberry achieves the same cleaning action from a molecule it evolved in a tropical tree for reasons entirely unrelated to human hygiene, which ancient Pacific peoples observed, adopted, and systematically used. In East Asia, in the Mediterranean basin, in the forests of northern Europe, in the grasslands of sub-Saharan Africa, the pattern repeats, independently and consistently, in every ecosystem where human populations lived long enough to develop a working relationship with local plant life. Different plants, same underlying chemistry. Soapwort, Saponaria officinalis, in Europe, used in traditional wool washing that continues in some specialty textile contexts to this day. Yucca root in the American Southwest, documented extensively in the ethnobotanical record of Navajo and Pueblo peoples. Soapweed, Yucca glauca, across the American plains. Goosefoot and Chenopodium species distributed across Eurasia. The husks of quinoa, Chenopodium quinoa, in the Andes, used by Quechua communities to wash both hair and woven textiles with measurable cleaning effectiveness. Every ecosystem, given enough time and enough observant humans paying careful attention to outcomes, yielded its local saponin source to the people who lived in it. The knowledge was the technology, and the process of discovery, identifying which roots foamed and which didn't, which plants foamed but left the skin irritated, or the hair dull versus which cleaned without causing damage, which materials kept their properties when dried and stored versus which had to be used immediately fresh, which worked best on hair versus body skin versus woven textiles, took thousands of years of communal, distributed, iterative observation and refinement. Every generation refined what the last had observed. Every community shared knowledge across kinship networks and trade relationships. The accumulation was slow, it was real, but saponin plants addressed the surface. There's a different cleaning problem that goes deeper. What about the skin itself, the biological surface beneath whatever visible contamination has accumulated on it? Because cleanliness in the ancient world was never purely about external contamination arriving from outside. The skin produces its own problems continuously. Sebum builds up. Dead cells accumulate in layers. The warm, oil-rich environment of skin between washing events is precisely the environment that opportunistic pathogens require to establish themselves and proliferate. You cannot resolve these problems through plant surfactants alone. They are produced by the biological activity of being alive. The answer here begins, almost universally, with fat. Across multiple ancient cultures separated by oceans and continents, and every possible dimension of cultural difference. Researchers examining both the direct archaeological record and the earliest written accounts find near-identical cleaning practices built around the deliberate application of fats or oils to the skin surface, followed by systematic physical removal. This is not a vague resemblance to moisturizing. Mechanically and chemically, it is one of the most effective approaches possible to cleaning a biological surface that produces its own oils. The principle is the same principle chemists rediscovered when formulating modern makeup removers and oil-cleansing facial products. Oil binds to oil. Fresh oil applied to skin bonds with existing sebum, with dead cells suspended in that sebum, with any oil-soluble debris or contamination present on the surface. Then physical scraping removes the entire combined layer, the fresh oil and everything it has bound, off the surface in a single systematic pass, leaving clean skin beneath. In ancient Egypt, this practice is documented with extraordinary archaeological specificity. The artisan community at Deir el-Medina, the workers' village on the west bank of the Nile opposite Thebes, inhabited continuously from approximately the 18th dynasty through the Ramesside period, roughly 1550 to 1070 BCE, was the community responsible for cutting and decorating the royal tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Tomb paintings from the site depict workers applying oil as part of daily body maintenance, but paintings are interpretation, open to debate about intent and meaning. What is not interpretation are the physical objects that French archaeologist Bernard Bruyère and his teams recovered during excavations beginning in the 1920s, small stone and fired ceramic vessels recovered from domestic contexts, from kitchen areas, from sleeping rooms, from the small courtyard spaces between houses, containing residual organic material that had survived the millennia in the dry Egyptian climate. Chemical analysis conducted by researchers in the 20th century on samples from multiple of these vessels identified a consistent type of contents, a mixture of castor oil and animal fat, not a random accumulation of whatever was available, a prepared compound combining two specific ingredients in proportions consistent with an intentional formulation designed for a specific purpose. These were not perfumes. They were not cosmetics in the modern decorative sense. They were functional skin-cleaning preparations used as the daily hygiene baseline for working people doing physically demanding manual labor. This interpretation is confirmed not by the vessel contents alone, but by administrative records recovered from the village itself. The ostraka, fragments of pottery and limestone flake used as informal writing surfaces for administrative records. Work logs and letters from Deir el-Medina include ration records listing oil as a regular supply item issued to workers alongside their bread and beer allowances. Oil was not distributed as a luxury. It was distributed as a functional necessity, with the same administrative priority as food, because in the absence of soap it was what kept the workforce functional. When oil deliveries were delayed, something the records document several times, workers sometimes stopped reporting to the tomb-cutting sites. The oil supply was a labor supply issue, the physical removal tool that completed the oil cleaning process. The strigil is most recognizable from its Greek and Roman bronze and iron forms, where it became an icon of athletic culture, so recognizable that it appears in sculpture, painting, poetry, and practical handbooks. In Athens from the 5th century BCE onward, the gymnasium was not primarily a space for athletic performance in any competitive sense. It was, functionally, a space for communal body maintenance. Any male citizen of the appropriate social standing who used the gymnasium would coat himself in olive oil before physical training, then after training use a strigil to systematically scrape the combined layer of oil, sweat, and loosen dead skin from his body in a methodical pass from shoulder to ankle. The back, for obvious anatomical reasons, required assistance, and that assistance was provided by a specific attendant role within the gymnasium economy. The residue collected on the strigil, an oily, slightly gritty paste of used olive oil, exfoliated skin cells, and sweat, was valued beyond the gymnasium. Ancient writers, including the physician Galen writing in the 2nd century CE, note that strigil scrapings from celebrated athletes were collected, sold, and applied by ordinary buyers to aching muscles or inflamed joints or minor skin injuries, under the assumption that the mixture had therapeutic properties derived from its origin with an exceptional healthy, well-maintained body. This sounds bizarre from a modern perspective until the chemistry is examined. Oleic acid, the primary fatty acid in olive oil, comprising approximately 70% of its total fatty acid composition, inhibits several common skin pathogens at concentrations achievable from topical application. In 2001, Dr. Gudmundur Bergson and colleagues at the University of Iceland published findings in Antimicrobial Agents and Chemotherapy demonstrating that oleic acid effectively inhibits Staphylococcus aureus, one of the most significant skin pathogens in both ancient and modern contexts, at concentrations well within the range present on skin after standard topical oil application. The people applying strigil scrapings weren't simply getting clean, They were, as an incidental consequence of their cleaning method, applying an antimicrobial agent to their largest organ every time they oiled and scraped. In 2011, Dr. Patrick McGovern at the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology published chemical analysis results from organic residue found in clay vessels recovered from Bronze Age sites across the eastern Mediterranean. The vessel types, their context in domestic spaces, their shapes consistent with containers for personal care preparations, were interpreted as cosmetic and hygienic containers. The residues inside told a more complex story than simple fat or oil. Multiple vessels contained complex mixtures, plant oils blended with animal fats, combined with beeswax, the combination suggesting a preparation designed for specific consistency and application properties. But in several vessels, additional materials had been incorporated that went significantly beyond basic fat mixture. A Phoenician-era vessel from a site in modern Lebanon contained juniper resin. A vessel from the Aegean coast region contained pine tar. Neither addition is a random or accidental incorporation. Juniper resin contains terpenoid compounds, including alpha-pinene and thujapsine, which in laboratory testing inhibit multiple gram-positive bacteria relevant to skin infection. Pine tar, which has been used continuously in dermatological contexts from ancient times through modern prescription preparations for eczema and psoriasis, contains phenolic compounds with well-documented antifungal and bacteriostatic properties. Someone in the Bronze Age Mediterranean, not a chemist, not a laboratory researcher, but a person with access to accumulated practical knowledge about outcomes, knew from experience that adding these specific materials to a fat preparation made the preparation better, made skin treated with it less prone to recurrent infections, made wounds in clean skin less likely to fester. The knowledge was real. The explanatory vocabulary for it wouldn't exist for approximately 3,000 years. That's the part that keeps deserving emphasis. The knowledge preceded the explanation. By a very long time. Here's where it gets even more interesting, because all of the botanical intelligence and all the oil and scrape technique in the ancient world operated on top of a biological system that modern hygiene practice has largely disabled without replacing, a system built into the human body itself that ancient humans accessed simply by living the way they lived. Movement. Here's the fact the personal care industry has no financial incentive to discuss prominently. Sustained physical movement is itself a cleaning mechanism. A genuinely functional one, not a metaphor for it, not incidentally related to it. A direct, mechanically operating biological process that produces antimicrobial protection on the body's surface as a direct output of the exertion required to move continuously through the world. Human eccrine sweat glands, the primary sweat-secreting glands distributed across most of the body's surface, distinct from the apocrine glands associated with stress response, secrete, alongside the expected mixture of water and electrolytes, a small antimicrobial peptide called dermicidin. Dermicidin is not an incidental byproduct. It is a protein specifically expressed in eccrine sweat gland tissue and specifically secreted onto the skin surface during sweating, where it forms a thin, persistent protective layer that remains active against pathogens for extended periods after the sweating event ends. In 2001, Dr. Birgit Schittek and colleagues at the University of Tübingen, working in the field of innate immunity and skin biology, published findings in Nature Immunology demonstrating that dermicidin persists on the skin surface for hours after sweat evaporation, maintains antimicrobial activity across a pH range from 5 to 7. 5, which covers essentially all conditions the skin surface experiences, and at the concentrations produced by sustained physical exertion, effectively inhibits Escherichia coli, Staphylococcus aureus, and Candida albicans. That last trio is worth emphasizing. E. coli as a gram-negative bacterial threat, Staphylococcus aureus as the most common bacterial skin pathogen and a cause of serious systemic infection when skin integrity is compromised, and Candida albicans as the most prevalent opportunistic fungal pathogen on skin surfaces. Dermicidin addresses all three simultaneously. The critical detail is the word sustained. Dermicidin production is upregulated significantly during the kind of continuous full-body exertion that extended walking, running, climbing, and hauling produce. It is not substantially generated by the brief localized sweating associated with a stress response in a sedentary context, and it is not generated in meaningful protective concentrations during the kind of minimal ambient physical activity that characterizes most modern daily routines. For a hunter-gatherer, this was not optional. It was not a fitness choice or a wellness practice. Covering the distance required to find, pursue, gather, and transport food, and then to carry it back, was the unavoidable physical output of surviving. The dermicidin response was continuous, maintained daily, present on the skin at protective concentrations as a constant feature of the lifestyle. The data on how far ancient foragers actually moved is not speculative inference. It is direct measurement from surviving populations maintaining traditional foraging lifestyles. Dr. Richard Borsche-Lee at the University of Toronto conducted the most detailed longitudinal study of hunter-gatherer activity and energetics ever completed, working with the Kungsan people of the Kalahari Basin in Botswana, beginning in the 1960s, research published in multiple contexts through academic presses and synthesized in his landmark 1979 Cambridge University Press book. Lee's measurements documented that Kungsan adult men and women covered between 7 and 19 kilometers per day during standard food-securing activity, a range reflecting seasonal variation, site-to-site variation in resource density, and the difference between days focused on plant gathering versus days requiring active pursuit of game over difficult terrain. Peak exertion events, the final pursuit of large prey, the hauling of a large carcass, the rapid relocation required when a resource site was exhausted, exceeded in physical demand anything that the majority of people in modern sedentary employment experience in a standard week. The average American adult today covers approximately 3,000 to 4,000 steps per day. That translates to roughly 5 miles, or 3 to 4 kilometers on mostly flat paved surfaces with no load-bearing component and no terrain navigation requirement. A Kungsan adult on an ordinary foraging day covered 3 to 5 times that distance as a minimum, with peak exertion episodes that the step count metric doesn't begin to capture. At modern activity levels, the dermacidin response operates at a fraction of its functional capacity. The sustained sweat production that generates protective concentrations of the peptide on the skin surface that creates the thin biological armor layer the body evolved to maintain against opportunistic pathogen colonization is simply not triggered by most modern daily routines. The biological defense mechanism is present in every human body. The lifestyle that activates it has been systematically engineered away over the last century of urbanization, mechanized transportation, and sedentary employment. This means something specific about how ancient hygiene should be understood. Ancient humans were not operating with a biological deficit that modern hygiene products compensate for. In at least one specific, measurable, mechanistically understood biological domain, they were operating with a biological advantage, a continuously active antimicrobial surface on their skin that modern sedentary life has quietly suppressed. Then the same industrial system that created the sedentary lifestyle sells products that partially address the consequences of the suppression. Everyone assumes ancient people needed external cleaning agents more than modern people do because they had access to fewer of them. In the specific domain of sweat-derived antimicrobial protection, they needed them less because their bodies were producing what modern bodies in standard conditions mostly are not. So what about wounds? Because all of the above describes maintenance hygiene, the ongoing management of a healthy body's tendency to accumulate contamination and produce its own biological vulnerabilities. Wounds are different in kind. A wound disrupts the integrity of the barrier that everything else works to maintain. It creates a direct pathway from the outside world to the body's interior. In a pre-industrial context, without antibiotics, without surgical antiseptic, without hospital infection control, a wound that turned septic was a death sentence, often enough to shape how entire cultures understood injury, risk, and the obligations of practical knowledge transmission. The immune system, working without pharmaceutical backup of any kind, had one attempt to contain an infection before it became systemic. If that attempt failed, there was nothing else available. Ancient cultures understood this at a practical level long before any explanatory framework for infection existed, and across cultures with no contact with each other, separated by oceans and continents and thousands of years of independent development, the most consistently documented wound treatment in the entire ancient medical record is the same substance, honey. The initial reaction most people have to this is amusement, then curiosity. Then when the biochemistry is actually laid out in detail, something that functions like a recalibration of assumptions, because honey is not a folk remedy or a placebo or a cultural tradition with emotional significance and no empirical basis. It is a legitimate, clinically documented antimicrobial agent with not one but 3 independent mechanisms of action, any single one of which would be sufficient to justify its use in wound care by the standards of modern evidence-based medicine. The first mechanism is osmotic. Honey's water content is extremely low. Its water activity, measured on a scale where 0 equals pure water and decreasing values indicate progressively less available water, runs between 56 and 62 in most natural honeys. Most bacteria require a water activity of at least 0, 91 to maintain metabolic function and reproduce. In the presence of honey, bacterial cells placed in contact with the honey surface lose water through osmosis to the surrounding high solute environment. They desiccate. Their metabolic processes fail. They die. This mechanism requires nothing specific about the chemical composition of honey beyond its concentrated sugar content. It is a direct physical consequence of what honey is. The second mechanism is acid. Honey's pH ranges between 3, 2, and 4, 5 depending on its floral source, processing history, and age. The majority of wound-infecting bacteria maintain optimal metabolic function at pH values between 6 and 8, with growth inhibited progressively below 5 and stopped entirely below 4 for most clinically significant pathogens. The natural acidity of honey alone, independently of any other property, creates an environment at the wound surface that is directly hostile to bacterial survival and proliferation. The third mechanism is chemical and sustained. When honey contacts wound fluid, which contains the water that honey itself lacks, the enzyme glucose oxidase present in honey in concentrations that are low in pure honey but activated when dilution provides sufficient water, begins converting the glucose present in honey to gluconic acid and hydrogen peroxide. The hydrogen peroxide concentration produced by this reaction is deliberately low, estimated at approximately 1 millimolar, sufficient to inhibit pathogen growth without being concentrated enough to damage healing tissue. And the production is sustained, continuing for hours after honey is applied to a wound as long as wound fluid continues to dilute the honey surface. This creates a continuously renewed, low-level antimicrobial environment at the wound site that prevents pathogen re-establishment after the initial kill. Medical-grade Manuka honey from New Zealand contains a fourth distinct mechanism: high concentrations of methylglyoxal, abbreviated MgO, a small reactive dicarbonyl compound with specific activity against bacterial strains that have developed resistance to conventional antibiotic classes. MgO concentrations in high-grade Manuka honey run between 250 and 800 milligrams per kilogram and higher in select preparations, and its effectiveness against methicillin-resistant Staphylococcus aureus, MRSA, one of the most clinically dangerous antibiotic-resistant organisms in modern hospital settings, was formally documented in a 2009 study by Dr. Shona Blair at the University of Sydney, published in the European Journal of Clinical Microbiology and Infectious Diseases. The study found that high MgO Manuka honey inhibited MRSA at concentrations, placing it among the most effective available options against that specific pathogen, a pathogen that regularly defeats the most powerful synthetic antibiotics available. Ancient humans knew none of this chemistry. They knew only what they had observed: that wounds treated with honey did not rot the way untreated wounds did. That people who received honey-packed wound dressings survived at higher rates. That the practice repeated across enough cases to distinguish it from random variation produced better outcomes than its absence. That was sufficient knowledge to embed the practice permanently into medical tradition across every ancient culture that left records detailed enough to examine. The Egyptian medical papyri are explicit. The Ebers Papyrus, dated to approximately 1550 BCE, spanning 110 columns of continuous hieratic text on a roll nearly 20 meters long, considered the most extensive surviving medical document from ancient Egypt, and named for the German Egyptologist Georg Ebers, who acquired it in Luxor in 1872, contains honey as an ingredient or standalone treatment in wound care contexts at least 147 separate times across its approximately 877 individual remedy entries. This is not a marginal footnote or a minor tradition. Honey is the most frequently cited wound treatment in the document. The Edwin Smith Papyrus, dated slightly earlier to approximately 1600 BCE and structured as a surgical case text moving systematically through wound types from head injuries to chest injuries, prescribes honey and fat poultices for specific injury categories with enough clinical precision to specify application quantity, appropriate dressing materials, and expected healing trajectories over time. These are not primitive guesses recorded in an ancient language. These are clinical notes from a medical tradition sophisticated enough to distinguish between wound types, to describe different treatments for different presentations, and to record expected outcomes in terms precise enough to be clinically informative. The honey they prescribed worked for reasons they didn't understand. It worked anyway. And then there is a substance whose place in ancient cleaning practice is so well documented, so cross-culturally consistent, and so chemically explicable that it produced one of the most famous phrases in the entire history of Latin literature, and yet remains, for obvious reasons, almost entirely absent from modern hygiene conversations. Urine. The typical response to this is a sequence. Initial laughter, then skepticism, then, when the evidence is presented in its full extent, a genuine revision of assumptions. The evidence is extensive. Human urine contains in its fresh state approximately 2% urea, the primary metabolic end product of protein catabolism, formed in the liver from the breakdown of amino acids and excreted by the kidneys as the body's main nitrogen waste product. As urine ages at ambient temperature, urea undergoes progressive hydrolysis. It reacts with water and breaks down into ammonia and carbon dioxide. Ammonia dissolved in water forms ammonium hydroxide, an alkaline solution with a pH in the range of 11 to 12. At that level of alkalinity, ammonium hydroxide functions as an effective surfactant and protein denaturing agent. It breaks down protein-based stains, it saponifies fats, it disrupts the cell membranes of many common bacteria, and it is, by any reasonable chemical analysis, a functional cleaning agent with a specific mechanism that explains its effectiveness, rather than merely asserting it. This is why ancient Romans collected it. Not incidentally, not as folklore, not as an isolated eccentric practice, as an organized, economically significant, commercially structured industry. The Fullones, the commercial launderers of the Roman world, operated at urban scale throughout the empire. In Rome itself, in Pompeii, in Ostia, and at urban sites across the Roman Mediterranean, archaeological excavation has consistently revealed the physical infrastructure of organized laundry operations. Excavations at Pompeii, the city preserved in extraordinary detail by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE, identified at the site of the Polonica Stefani, one of the largest laundry operations in the city, a series of large clay vessels set into the floor in the entrance area, along with a spatial layout optimized for sequential soaking, treading, and rinsing of cloth. Historical texts confirm the collection practice. Large ceramic amphorae were placed at street corners throughout Roman cities to collect urine from passers-by, and the collected urine was then purchased by the laundry trade and used as the primary cleaning agent for wool, the textile from which Roman togas and other quality fabric garments were made. Wool is a protein fiber. Its protein structure bonds to organic contamination. Ammonia denatures both the contamination and the bond holding it to the fiber, releasing the stain into the wash water. The economic scale of the practice was sufficient to attract imperial taxation. The Emperor Vespasian, ruling from 69 to 79 CE, introduced a tax on collected urine from public lavatories, the vectigal urinae. According to Suetonius, writing his biographical accounts of Roman emperors in the early 2nd century CE, Vespasian's son Titus objected to the vulgarity of deriving state revenue from the urine trade. Vespasian's reported response, holding a coin under Titus's nose and saying pecunia non olet, money does not smell, has survived 2,000 years as one of the most recognizable Latin epigrams, an idiom for revenue that is economically acceptable regardless of its origin. The phrase exists because the urine trade was real, was large, and was worth taxing at the level of imperial fiscal policy. In the Scottish Highlands, the traditional process of walking, fulling newly woven wool by treading it repeatedly in liquid to clean and thicken the fibers, used human urine as the active cleaning agent in a practice documented as standard procedure as recently as the 18th century. Walking was performed communally in dedicated spaces as part of organized textile production. It worked reliably for generations of communities with no alternative chemistry available and no interest in using something that didn't produce results. The ammonia was the mechanism. The results were real. Ancient humans were not wrong about urine. They were describing accurately, if inexplicably, the cleaning action of an alkaline surfactant that they happened to produce internally in convenient quantities free of charge continuously, and they used it. Here's the dimension of ancient hygiene that modern accounts almost consistently underemphasize, and that may in some ways be the most important of all. Ancient cleanliness was maintained not primarily through individual discipline or product access, but through social structure and ritual embedding. The physical act of one individual cleaning another's body, social grooming in the language of primatology, is documented as a core behavior in virtually every primate species closely related to humans. Chimpanzees, at a genetic distance from humans of approximately 1–2% DNA sequence divergence, dedicate substantial portions of their waking social time to grooming each other. In some observed populations living in environments where resource competition is intense and social alliance formation is correspondingly critical, up to 20% of all daytime social interaction time is spent in grooming. Bonobos, gorillas, and orangutans all engage in the practice as a central social behavior rather than a peripheral one. The function is dual, and both functions are real. The physical cleaning is genuine. Ectoparasites, ticks, lice, mites, are physically located and removed. Wound sites in difficult-to-reach areas are cleared of contaminating debris, skin in the 30% to 40% of body surface that is effectively inaccessible to self-cleaning is maintained. Beyond the physical outcomes, grooming releases beta endorphins in both the individual being groomed and the individual performing the grooming and reinforces social bonds in ways measurably associated with both survival outcomes and reproductive success in observed primate populations. A chimpanzee with strong grooming relationships has demonstrated social allies, individuals who will provide support during competitive conflicts, who will share food resources under pressure, who will cooperate in ways that enhance the survival probability of both parties. Dr. Robin Dunbar at the University of Oxford has developed, over decades of research, what is now known as the social brain hypothesis. The argument that the extraordinary expansion of the neocortex in the hominin lineage was driven primarily not by the demands of tool use or environmental navigation, but by the computational demands of tracking and managing complex social relationships in large groups. Grooming sits at the center of this framework because grooming is the primary mechanism through which social alliances are built and maintained in most primates, and because grooming has a hard mathematical scaling constraint: one individual grooming one other individual at a time, at the rates observed in chimpanzee populations, can maintain alliances with approximately 50 group members before the time cost becomes unsustainable. Human social groups, even in Paleolithic contexts, regularly exceeded that number. Dunbar's argument, developed in detail in his 1996 book published by Harvard University Press and in extensive subsequent research through the Royal Society and Oxford Academic Publishing, is that human language emerged as a scaling solution to exactly this bottleneck. Spoken language allows something functionally analogous to grooming, the building and maintenance of social bonds through direct, intimate, two-way communication, but at larger scale, with multiple individuals and without the time cost of physical contact. Conversation is, in this framing, social grooming made scalable. The cleaning function was offloaded to tools and plants as the cognitive resources that grooming had occupied were redirected toward the behavioral flexibility that eventually became language. If this account is even partially accurate in its broad outlines, and Dunbar's comparative primate evidence across multiple decades of research lends it considerable structural support, then human speech may have roots in the act of picking parasites from each other's scalps. The cleaning came first. The conversation that eventually replaced it evolved from the social need that the cleaning was serving. Ancient humans didn't just groom for cleanliness. They groomed to function as the social animals their survival absolutely required them to be. And out of that necessity, the need simultaneously to stay clean and to maintain the social bonds that made group survival possible, something that eventually became the distinctive human capacity for language may have grown directly. The Indus Valley Civilization, flourishing from approximately 3000 to 1500 BCE in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India, represents the most dramatic ancient example of what happens when a civilization treats sanitation infrastructure as a primary planning priority, rather than an afterthought. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro, excavated by archaeologist Ernest Mackay working for the Archaeological Survey of India in the late 1920s, at a site in the Sindh province of modern Pakistan, is a watertight brick structure measuring approximately 12 meters long, 7 meters wide, and 4 meters deep, fed by fresh water and connected to a drainage system that integrated with covered brick sewers running beneath the streets of the planned city. The bath's watertight construction used the deliberate double brick technique with a layer of bitumen between the two brick faces, an engineering solution to waterproofing that required specific knowledge of material behavior and deliberate planning to execute. Radiocarbon dating of materials at the site places the relevant construction phases at approximately 2600 to 1900 BCE. This makes Mohenjo-Daro's drainage infrastructure older than the Roman sewer network, the Cloaca Maxima of Rome, the most famous ancient sanitation engineering project, with construction traditionally dated beginning around 600 BCE by approximately 2,000 years. Individual residential structures at Mohenjo-Daro had private bathing platforms with drainage channels connecting to the municipal system. Approximately 700 wells have been identified at the site, distributed through the residential areas in patterns suggesting that freshwater access was a planning requirement at the residential scale, not just at civic monuments. The sanitation infrastructure at Mohenjo-Daro was not built as an addition to an already existing city. It appears in the earliest layers of planned construction, embedded in the city's design from the beginning rather than retrofitted later when resources allowed. Whoever planned and executed this city considered water access and waste removal a fundamental prerequisite for urban life rather than a luxury upgrade. They were, functionally, right. Cities that did not make similar investments in sanitation faced recurrent epidemic disease that periodically reduced urban populations faster than rural immigration could replace them. Ancient Rome understood this logic, applied it at a different scale, and produced the aqueduct system as its answer. The Aqua Marcia, completed in 144 BCE, under the supervision of the praetor Quintus Marcius Rex, stretched approximately 91 kilometers from its source springs in the Anio Valley to the city of Rome, delivering approximately 190,000 cubic meters of fresh water daily at the height of its operation, according to estimates derived from Frontinus's late 1st century CE administrative survey of Rome's water system. The Aqua Claudia, completed in 52 CE, added another 69 kilometers of conveyance infrastructure. The engineering required for these systems, surveying to achieve consistent gravitational gradients over long distances, tunnel construction through solid rock, bridge construction over valleys, distribution infrastructure within the city, represented a multi-generational public investment that only makes sense as a priority if the civilization making it understood, at some level, that population density without water supply and waste removal was an existential threat. The Romans did not have germ theory, but they had the empirical record of what happened to cities that didn't build these systems. That was enough. There is one more thing to say, one that the archaeology and the biochemistry and the engineering all circle around but don't quite name directly. The skin microbiome. The skin is not a surface to be sterilized. This bears repeating, because the entire logic of most commercial hygiene product marketing assumes the opposite. The skin is a habitat, approximately 1.8 square meters of it on the average adult body, hosting a community of approximately 1,000 documented bacterial species in a healthy person, along with associated fungi, archaea, and viruses, all living in complex ecological relationships with each other and with the immune system underneath. Dr. Julia Segre at the National Human Genome Research Institute, whose research on the skin microbiome has been supported through NIH funding and published in journals including Nature Reviews Microbiology, has documented that the skin's resident microbial community is not there despite the immune system's best efforts to eliminate it. It is there because the immune system specifically tolerates it. Because over millions of years of coevolution, these organisms have evolved relationships with human skin that provide measurable benefits to the host. Resident bacteria outcompete pathogenic organisms for the surface attachment sites and nutritional resources that both need. They produce bacteriocins, targeted antimicrobial compounds, that specifically inhibit pathogens. They regulate the skin's chemical environment toward pH values and conditions that discourage pathogens. They train the adaptive immune system in ways that are demonstrably important for long-term immune function. Children raised in environments with reduced microbial exposure show consistently higher rates of allergic sensitization and atopic dermatitis in multiple longitudinal studies. Daily washing with commercial surfactant products disrupts this community. The disruption is temporary in acute terms. The microbiome substantially restores to its baseline composition within hours to a few days after a single washing event. But chronic, high-frequency disruption with harsh synthetic surfactants repeatedly interrupts the community's ecological equilibrium, selecting over time for species that tolerate disruption rather than for species that provide the greatest host benefit, and chronically reducing microbial diversity in ways that are detectable in population-level comparisons. The concept of daily showering as a hygiene baseline is not ancient wisdom. It is not grounded in pre-industrial practice. It is not the product of germ theory's discovery of why hygiene matters. It is a post-World War II phenomenon. Indoor plumbing became universal across American and Western European households roughly between 1940 and 1960, and the advertising industry, already experienced from a generation of antiperspirant marketing in creating hygienic norms that sold products, rapidly established daily bathing as the social baseline. The academic history of this process is documented in detail in sociologist Julianne Sivolka's research, which traces how the concept of body odor as a socially catastrophic problem requiring daily chemical intervention was substantially constructed by commercial advertising campaigns beginning in the 1910s and accelerating through the 1920s and 1930s. Odor had existed before, social stigma attached to it at the level of professional failure and romantic rejection, stigma intense enough to drive daily antiperspirant and soap purchase across an entire population, was built through targeted advertising that ran in women's magazines and linked natural body function to social and romantic failure. The bar against which ancient hygiene is routinely measured was not discovered through neutral observation of human biological requirements. It was moved, deliberately and profitably, by companies whose revenue depended on the movement. And the movement of that bar has had consequences that go beyond consumer spending. Dermatologist Dr. Sandy Scott-Nickey at the University of Toronto, whose clinical practice has focused on skin barrier function and whose research appears in peer-reviewed dermatology literature, has documented the relationship between overwashing and the rise of skin conditions including atopic dermatitis, contact dermatitis, and xerosis, chronic skin dryness. In industrialized populations, the causation is not absolute, and environmental and dietary factors contribute. But the correlation between increased product use and increased prevalence of certain skin conditions in populations that adopted high-frequency washing practices is consistent enough across multiple observational studies to be clinically notable. The paradox is precise. The more aggressively modern hygiene practice attempts to maintain the skin's surface cleanliness, the more it may be disrupting the biological system that the skin evolved to maintain on its own. The ancient person who washed once a week with a saponin root and spent the intervening days sweating through sustained movement was not dirtier by biological standards than the modern person washing daily with sodium lauryl sulfate. They may have been better defended, not by their cleaning, but by everything their lifestyle left intact that modern life has removed. This is not an argument for abandoning soap. It is an argument for understanding what soap is compensating for and recognizing that ancient humans didn't need the compensation because they hadn't created the deficit. So here you are again. Same morning, same 30 seconds, same automatic reach. The soap is real. The running water is real. The hygiene it provides, the measurable reduction in pathogen transmission, the genuine public health achievements of the 20th century's sanitation infrastructure, the tooth you still have at 40 that your pre-agricultural ancestor lost at 30, all of that is real. But so was what came before it. The hands that beat agave root against a wet stone were not fumbling in the dark. They were operating a surfactant chemistry that worked. The mouth that chewed poplar bark and held it against the gum until the inflammation receded was not guessing. It was applying accumulated botanical knowledge refined across dozens of generations of careful observation. The wound packed with honey was not an act of superstition. It was the application of a three-mechanism antimicrobial treatment that laboratory science took until the 20th century to fully explain, but that observed outcomes confirmed reliably for at least 4,000 years. What ancient humans had was not a cruder version of what modern people have. It was a different system, one built from observation and sustained by community transmission, and maintained through social and ritual structures that made compliance automatic rather than individual. They had biological defenses, activated by unavoidable daily movement, that modern sedentary life has suppressed. They had communal cleaning practices embedded in the social fabric of daily life that made isolation from cleanliness as socially impossible as isolation from the community itself. They had thousands of years of refined knowledge about which plants in their specific environment addressed which specific problems on which specific parts of the body, knowledge that took longer to accumulate than any individual life, that was held collectively across generations, and that was largely lost when the people who held it were dispersed, colonized, or simply replaced by the mass production system that offered a universal bottle in its place. There's something quietly remarkable about the fact that when modern dermatology looked closely enough at Salvadora persica wood, it found a better antibacterial than chlorhexidine. That when microbiologists studied dermcidin, they found a sophisticated pathogen-suppressing peptide that the body delivers automatically to anyone who moves enough. That when wound care researchers tested honey against MRSA, a bacterium that defeats multiple classes of synthetic antibiotics, they found a 4,000-year-old treatment that still worked. These weren't lucky guesses by people fumbling in the dark. They were the outputs of a long, serious collective intelligence applied to the most basic problem every human body faces: staying functional in a world full of things that want to break it down. The soap doesn't know what it's doing. The hands that spent 50,000 years learning to live without it, carefully, communally, observantly, did.